Alrighty, so this video is if you want to redo your lab, which I highly recommend doing if you failed it. So I'm going to go back over the directions and explain how you probably should redo it. Keep your data that you got from last time. Remember that when you are writing your hypothesis, it should be in the form of a if-then statement, and it needs to be specific. And what I mean by specific is it needs to explain like what degrees you are using and the ratchets you are using. So for example, you could say something like, if I pull the gymnast back at 45 degrees with no ratchets on the wheels, then the gymnast will move forward or backwards, whatever number of centimeters you think that they would move. So if you did not write your hypothesis in the form of an if-then statement, you lost points because hypotheses have to be written in the if-then form. And just overall, make sure you are writing in complete sentences. Even when you are answering these questions, you got a point off for every incomplete sentence that you had. So again, for each hypothesis you have, make it an if-then statement. That's very important. For your variables, remember that your independent variable is what you change on purpose. So in the lab, go back and think about what you changed between each experiment on purpose. There's technically two different variables that we messed with. You only have to write one, but think about what you changed on purpose. Your dependent is what you measured. So think about what you were measuring, the data that you collected for each trial. That would be your dependent. Your control is what stayed the same. So think about all the things that you didn't mess with, that you kept the same, that you weren't measuring. Basically, everything else would be your control variables. Now for your forces, what force pulls the gymnast down from the bar? Think about the force that pulls everything down on the earth. For the force that makes your gymnast go in the same direction, think about Newton's laws that we have been studying. There is a term for what an object will continue to do. So if an object is like sitting on a desk, it will keep sitting on the desk until something moves it. And if an object is moving, it will keep moving in that same direction until something stops it. There's a word for that. That word is the force that keeps the gymnast going in the same direction. The force that makes the gymnast slow down, there is a term for basically everything. English. There's a term that slows down everything on Earth. An example would be like rubbing your hands together, walking on the floor. Think of like the traction on your shoes. There's a scientific word for that slows everything down. For Newton's first law, remember that Newton's first law is about inertia, which again, if an object is sitting on a desk, it's going to keep sitting there until you move it. And if an object is moving, it's going to keep moving in that direction until you stop it. So think back to your lab, to your cart. Find an example of Newton's first law that you observed with your cart. For Newton's second law, remember that the second law has to do with force, mass, and acceleration. Basically, the more force you apply to something, the more it is going to accelerate. So think about points in your lab where the car accelerated more than other times and what would have caused that. For Newton's third law, think about what your car did with no ratchets on. It should have swung back and forth. And remember that Newton's third law is about everything having an equal and opposite reaction. So for example, if I'm sitting down in a chair, I'm putting force on the chair and the chair is putting force on me as well. So it goes both ways. It's equal and opposite. There's several examples of this in our lab, but think of something that would have been an equal and opposite force pair. Now for your elaborate, your claim, again, is basically rewriting your hypothesis. Okay, it doesn't have to be a big paragraph, just one sentence, your hypothesis. Your evidence, this is where you tell me about the data that you collected, and I want you to be specific with your numbers. So for example, you could say like, for my trials, we got, and then, list your numbers, make sure you put the units beside them, blah, blah, blah. You could say our average was whatever your average was. So something like that, but being very specific with your numbers. I should see numbers somewhere in this paragraph. The reasoning is what people typically struggled with the most. This is where you tell me if your data supported or rejected your hypothesis. It's not bad if your hypothesis was rejected. it just was, doesn't really matter. So you could say like, based on our data, the hypothesis was supported, not supported, whatever it was, and then because, and then you would explain why your hypothesis was not supported. This is also where you should have added in information about Newton's laws. This is where you could go back to this section here, whatever you wrote here, and you could use it to explain how your car moved. So for example, a lot of people wrote about Newton's second law, and they said that the more force they put on the gymnast, like the more force they used to lift it up higher to the 90 degrees, the more it accelerated. So you could say something like that. You could talk about Newton's third law and an opposite equal reaction pair. You could talk about Newton's first law, anything like that, but you should have included something about Newton's laws explaining the motion of your cart in your reasoning. So I hope this helps. I highly recommend you redo your lab if you failed it. You can get up to a 70 on it, which will help your grade a lot because this is a major assignment. So let me know if you have any other questions.